Hi there. Thanks for tuning in. This is the sermon video for May the 24th, 2020, and by now we are many weeks into the quarantine. This is Ascension Day, Sunday. Ascension Day took place on Thursday by the Christian calendar, and it's the story that we're going to be looking at today. And it brings with it an important question. What are you afraid of? Luke chapter 24, verses 36 to 49. While they were saying these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were afraid and terrified. They thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you startled? Why are doubts arising in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. It's really me. Touch me and see, for a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones like I have." As he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. Because they were wondering and questioning in the midst of their happiness, he said to them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of baked fish. Taking it, he ate it in front of them. Jesus said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. He said to them, "This is what is written, the Christ will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and a change of heart and life for the forgiveness of sins must be preached in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. Look, I am sending to you what my Father promised, but you are to stay in the city until you have been furnished with heavenly power." The Ascension Day story involves the disciples and Jesus and a surprise encounter between them. And to us, it doesn't seem like it should be a surprise, and to us, their reaction seems overblown in some ways, which sounds odd. After all, Jesus is resurrected and he has died, but they've seen him. Most of them have seen him, the people in the room, and so it shouldn't be a surprise, especially given the context. So if we read the sequence of events in Luke, the previous verses are the disciples coming back from Emmaus. And so here, two people who were walking encountered Jesus, the risen Jesus. They encountered him and his wisdom and his love and his fire. And they came back, they rushed back to Jerusalem to tell the people still gathered what had happened. So just after hearing this, the disciples are still, it says, they were afraid, terrified and afraid, startled and afraid, depending on which translation you're reading. So should they have been scared? Should they have been afraid of the circumstances? It's a fair question. We can't put ourselves in their shoes to determine how we would have reacted. So certainly fear makes sense, but maybe surprise doesn't. So what we have here in this account, in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 24, verse 37, my common English says, they were terrified and afraid, and they thought they were seeing a ghost. Terrified and afraid. This past week, when we were looking at our Philippians Bible study, we came across a familiar passage that had similar wording, and it brought to mind similar questions. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul encourages his readers, his audience, the Christians in Philippi, that they should work out their salvation in fear and trembling. And it makes us ask, is fear an appropriate emotion? Is fear an appropriate motivator in the Christian life or in any relationship? So I thought I would do a little bit of a linguistic deep dive with words.
here there are two words, and they're translated as terrified and afraid, startled and afraid. In Philippians, it says fear and trembling. And so to dig deeper, fear and trembling is also used a little bit later on in Hebrews, when the writer there is retelling the story of Moses. And it says in the same Greek words that Moses was terrified and afraid, that Moses was in fear and trembling in his encounter with God. Now, when there's a little pair of words together, sometimes we put words together because we need two words to describe two different things. Sometimes we put two words together because one word is not quite enough, and we add another just to emphasize the first word. And sometimes we put words together that just kind of feel nice together and don't really add much to each other. So, for example, in English, if someone were to come home from Christmas shopping, this seems to be the only time we use this pairing of words. If somebody were to say that, boy, there was a real hustle and bustle at the mall today, right? You wouldn't say, oh, there was a hustle and a bustle. No, you know those two words go together. They don't really add anything, but they work together to give one meaning. Sure, it was busy and rushed, but it was a hustle and a bustle. It just works well together. In Philippians, in the Greek, it says phobos kai tromos. Phobos, you might recognize the Greek root there of the word phobia, that's fear, phobos, kai tromos. And the Greek word, just like the English word trembling, brings to mind a kind of a shaking. And so those two words together mean separate things. Fear and trembling. Fear is the emotion of being afraid, and trembling is the shaking of the body that comes with the fear. So fear and trembling are literally two different things, but phobos kai tromos. That just kind of rolls, just like hustle and bustle. Well, here in our story from Luke, we don't have that kind of linguistic, poetic power. The words are even trickier to pronounce, so I won't try. But they do bring to mind similar things. So one of them is phobos, which means afraid or frightened, as the King James translates it. So this is the emotional thing. And the other word doesn't come up very often, which makes it more difficult for translators to accurately paint the contextual picture of what it means. But it seems to mean the opposite of falling down. So when we read startled in some of the translations, we sort of get that picture that you're surprised and, startled, suddenly jumping up. So the disciples were startled, meaning that they were surprised and reacting in surprise, but also afraid. And so if Luke had just given us one word that meant that they were startled, we might say, oh, no, they were just, they weren't expecting this, and so they jumped up out of surprise, as they would if anybody knocked on the door at an unexpected time. But the disciples were very much afraid in this moment. And in some ways, there's a contrast, too. So Luke tells us that Jesus enters the room and he says, "Peace be with you." But it was ineffective in conveying that peace because the disciples are responding with fear. So Jesus says peace, but there is no peace. And maybe the writer Luke is emphasizing that contrast. Right? Jesus came to bring peace. The people didn't want it because they were afraid, which is a metaphor for all of Jesus' work. Now, when Jesus walks in the room, when Jesus appears in the room, however he gets there, and he says, "Peace be with you," this isn't necessarily him intentionally saying, "I wanted there to be peace in this space." This is just the greeting. In all certainty, Jesus walked into the room and he said the Hebrew word, or the Aramaic equivalent, shalom. And if you have Arabic-speaking friends, whether they're Muslims or Christians, they will very often greet themselves by saying salam, which is shares the same origins. And my friends in Korea, they would greet each other with annyeonghaseyo. Annyeong is peace or stability, and it's just the way that you're greeting. And so when we say goodbye, you can go back into the Old English, and the roots are God be with you, ye, God be with ye. It kind of came together to mean goodbye. And when we say that, we aren't thinking God be with you. We're thinking, I'm leaving. This is the thing that I say when I'm leaving. When somebody sneezes and somebody says bless you, we're not thinking of the deeper spiritual significance of the encounter. That's just what we say. So Jesus appears in the room. Yeah, he wants there to be peace, because Jesus is a man of peace, the Prince of Peace. But Jesus is simply greeting them. Hello. Hi, guys. Annyeong, right? Salam. He's walking into the room, greeting his friends, greeting his followers. And they are afraid. We really don't like fear. This isn't a comfortable emotion for us. Within any relationship, if there's fear, we on the outside of that relationship become very suspicious. If we find children are afraid of their parents, we might dig deeper to see what that relationship looks like. If a child comes home from school and they demonstrate fear of their teacher, there might be a phone call to the school in that situation. Within a marriage relationship, if someone, especially if the woman is afraid of the husband, a long line of people will show up to help that woman extricate herself, remove herself from that relationship. We really don't believe that fear is appropriate in human relationships. But we used to think it a little bit more, even expecting it to be the case in some situations. Certainly within a workplace, we would expect a certain amount of fear of our authorities. A fear of your boss is healthy if that can motivate you. A little while ago in the hockey world, we had some coaches whose harsh words came to light. Some angry and some hurtful words were spoken in a dressing room. And some people reacted initially and said, this is unacceptable. These kinds of words are hurtful to these particular players, and especially these most notable cases, the words were along racial lines, and so certain players were unfairly targeted. But a lot of people responded and said, well, that's a locker room. The coach is allowed to use inflammatory language to motivate his people. An army general would certainly also be expected to speak harshly and angrily as a way of motivating. And if you're afraid of your coach, if you're afraid of your general, if you're afraid of the legal authorities, that's fine, some people would say, because fear is a good thing in a healthy way. But here in this story, it seems out of place for us. Now, some people in their reading of Scripture, they want to highlight God's anger and God's capacity to do harm. But it seems to me, within our more Anabaptist reading, that Jesus came as a man of peace, and he came with love and compassion, and so fear doesn't seem to be a weapon in his arsenal, to use a metaphor. But still, the apostles are afraid. The people in the room are afraid of who Jesus is. And so while they're sort of figuring out what's going on and adjusting to the reality, Jesus takes some food from them, partly to let them kind of catch up to what's happening, also to say, listen, you might think I'm a ghost. If you're afraid of ghosts, I'm not a ghost. Here's my hands. Remember, they were pierced. Here's my body, and here, give me this fish. I will eat it. It will go into my body. A ghost couldn't do that. So Jesus is there to reassure them that he is there in the flesh. He's not a ghost. But the question remains, is there a healthy kind of fear? Well, perhaps when Jesus appeared in the room, his arrival was a reminder to his followers of what they were supposed to be doing, of the work that they were supposed to have taken on, and yet they hadn't. They were still sitting in the room. Now, I hope that I'm not one who uses fear as a motivator for people in my life, especially for my children. But I know that there are times in my life where fear has been a very real consequence of my own inactions, but also a reflection of somebody's love and trust in me. So, without getting into details, there are times where I've been working somewhere and suddenly I realized I had done something wrong. And the return of the boss elicited fear in me, not because I was afraid of the punishment, but because I know that my boss had trusted me, that they had put trust in my role within that company, and that they were hoping for good things from me. And when I failed to live up to those expectations, I was in some ways unhappy about what the consequences might be in terms of my employment, in terms of my pride, but I knew that I had harmed the relationship. I knew that I had broken the trust. And so in that moment, then I was afraid of what I had done. Not afraid of punishment, not afraid of embarrassment. So for the disciples to be in the room and to be again in God's presence and in Jesus' presence, fear makes sense in that way. That they would once again be in the presence of a man that they love, that they have drawn close to, that they have learned from, that they have given their lives to. It's Jesus again. And we're still here. We haven't done the things that we were supposed to do. We're still sad. We're still unsure of what's going to happen next. We should be better than this. Our faith should be bigger than this. And so the arrival of Jesus, the return of Jesus, could very easily elicit fear in his disciples because of those reminders, the reminders of the ways that they had failed Jesus. I'm convinced that there are a lot of ways that we would respond with fear if we encounter Jesus again. And sometimes we're not really even aware of how we have wronged other people until we see them again, until we see the hurt in their faces, until we feel the disappointment, until we can feel the weakened relationship as a result of our words or actions or inactions. So the disciples, they gradually figure out, no, this is Jesus, not a ghost. And they also realize Jesus is here to reassure us, to empower us. And then they sort of flip it too far, right? Then they think, oh, now Jesus is coming back and he's going to bring back the kingdom. He's going to kick out the Romans finally. Now we're on the side of strength. We're on the side of power. And they got it back. They reverted to their old ways of blind confidence in the wrong things. We sometimes have fear of the consequences of what we have done, fear of the impact of a broken relationship. And that fear is natural and healthy and good in loving relationships. But it can't last. We are motivated by love. And so in our Christian life, we shouldn't be motivated by fear of hell, fear of God's punishment, we should be motivated by love. God's love for others, God's love for us, and then the love for others that we are supposed to have. So, if you were in this room, you might have been afraid too, and that's fine. In your moments of prayer, in your encounters with Jesus internally, there might be some fear there. There might be some fear that's stopping you from setting aside time to have an encounter with Jesus. And it doesn't mean that you are bad. It doesn't mean that you're a failure. It doesn't mean that God is angry. We are fearful when we are suddenly aware of the ways that we have broken relationship. But God hasn't come to remind us of that. God has come to draw near to us, to build that relationship, to nurture that relationship. So, whether we respond initially with fear, let us respond to God's presence. Let us respond to our encounter with Jesus in love, in compassion, and in peace. Thank you for joining me.